So welcome everyone to the Fueling Collaboration panel discussion series. My name is Andrea Brandon. I am the Science Delivery Specialist with the Northern Research Station, and it is my absolute privilege to be welcoming you all and introducing today's event. Fueling Collaboration is a panel discussion series presented by the Joint Fire Science Program's Fire Exchange Networks. Here in the East, it's the Consortium of Appalachian Fire Managers and Scientists, the Lake States Fire Science Consortium, the North Atlantic Fire Science Exchange, Oak Woodlands and Forest Fire Consortium, the Southern Fire Exchange, and the Tallgrass Prairie and Oak Savanna Fire Science Consortium. So in addition to these amazing groups, the Forest Service Northern Research Station and Southern Research Station all are presenting Fueling Collaboration. So this is our third season, and if you've joined us before, welcome back. And if this is your first time, we really hope you'll find today's event equally informative and fun. So our goals in Fueling Collaboration are to bring researchers and managers together to learn about and discuss the latest in fire science and application, and to build collaborative opportunities across the region. Today is the first in a four-part series, as well as our first panel discussion for our third season. In prior years, we discussed topics of fire history and its application to present-day forest management, fire seasonality and expanding the burn window, and fire in the wildland-urban interface in the East. All of those panel discussions use a similar format to what you'll see today. So if you did not join us in prior years and you're interested in learning a bit more, I welcome you to view those recordings. These and others are on our Fueling Collaboration, fuelingcollab.com website, and we'll just add a link to that in the chat here in just one moment. So today's discussion is focused on talking about fire, from building fire lines to researching fire trends over time. Fire management and science requires great communication to be successful. So our panelists will share their experiences and tips on how to effectively talk about fire and to gain support and build a collaborative network. We've got a great moderator lined up for you today. Jen Bunty, the Public Information Coordinator for the Consortium of Appalachian Fire Managers and Scientists, will be moderating our discussion. And Jen will introduce herself as well as our panelists in just a minute. But before we go on, I'd like to acknowledge the many organizers for today's event. So those listed here, Jen, myself, David, Craig, Virginia, Jack, Amanda, Stephanie, Joe, want to list all of those names. All of these folks here have contributed their expertise and attention to making today's event fun and interesting and informative. And so I just want to give a huge shout out to everyone here, and a thank you for making today's event successful, because I know it's going to be successful. So I'd also like to welcome you to future Fueling Collaboration panel discussions. As I mentioned, this is the first of a four-part series. So in December, we'll be talking about fire and water. January, fire and wildlife. And in February, we'll be discussing prescribed burning in the Eastern WUI. And so we hope that you'll be able to come back and join us for future discussions. So without further ado, it's my privilege to welcome Jen Bunty and to kick off today's discussion. Jen, the floor is yours.
Thank you. The virtual floor, the floor in my own house, right? Thank you, Andrea, for that intro. Thank you all for joining us today. I keep trying to find a different word than excited, but it's really the only one I've got for today. I've been thrilled all morning going through the questions and just getting ready for this discussion. So Andrea mentioned, my name is Jen Bunty. I'm the public info coordinator for CAFMS, the Consortium of Appalachian Fire Managers and Scientists. Basically, my job is to talk about fire all day, every day. I do that using social media, in-person meetings, getting out into the field with people whenever I can, educational signs, podcasts, really whatever tool I can use. I try to spread the gospel about fire. I've been told I'm a pyro evangelist. And so I couldn't be, like I said, I couldn't be more excited to spend today talking about fire with some of the best in the biz that we've identified through our team. We came up with this topic originally because we noticed that through the past 2 seasons, now we're in season 3 of Feeling Collaboration, through the past 2 seasons, when registrants would submit questions, while some of them were really technical or about data, a lot of them came down to, how do we talk to blank about this issue? How do we talk to our colleagues, the public, leadership, policymakers, private landowners, and specialty groups was one of the other groups that we listed in that poll. And it looks like we're pretty evenly split actually in those poll results on who we're finding challenging to talk to about fire. And so I am thrilled to be able to sit here with these panelists today. And I'm going to ask each of them to go ahead and introduce themselves because I'm sure they can do it better than I could. So panelists, I'm going to ask you one by one to introduce yourself and then share a recent communication success you've had. And just to give you a second to think about it, I'll share mine. It's not necessarily breaking through a communications barrier. We've had some of those successes recently too, but recently we've been able to establish a communications working group, a communications team that's cross-agency, cross-jurisdictional boundary, if you want to call it, and cross-organization through the Fire Learning Network and through the consortium in the Southern Blue Ridge. And we've got some really engaged partners in it. I see some of them are here, so shout out to my SBR comms folks. But it's one of those things where over the past couple of months, I'll sit in these meetings and calls and I think, yeah, this is really going to move the needle. And that happens so rarely. So that's my success to share for today. And I guess I'll pass the floor to John Weir. Would you like to go ahead and introduce yourself and talk about your comms success, a recent comms success?
Yeah, my name is John Weir. I'm an extension specialist at Oklahoma State University. Work with prescribed fire and fire ecology. Have been at OSU for 32 years. Doing that, working with prescribed fire, so I have a lot of experience with it. Work a lot with prescribed burn associations, developing and starting prescribed burn associations. I guess recent communications efforts and stuff, again, getting a couple of new burn associations started here in the last year. Again, working with private landowners, seeing that communication, working with them, get them to understand what they need to do and how they need to do it. And then, watching them step off the cliff and go do it themselves. That's the main thing to get done, and to see that, but also the collaboration that it takes to with some of the agencies and stuff that we work together with to do that and bringing everybody together. A big part of it.
Fantastic. Yeah, we're going to talk about some of those, building some of those relationships and those networks today too, I hope. How about Eric Toman? I'm seeing you on the top of my screen. Would you like to introduce yourself?
Hello, everyone. I'm Eric Tillman. It's good I followed John because I'm at a different OSU. So I'm at Ohio State University and did my graduate work at Oregon State University. So I think we have the OSUs covered between us. I'm a professor here. I'm a social scientist by training. Came out of the College of Forestry at Oregon State, though, and have been working on fire issues since I did my master's degree a long time ago. But thinking of communication wins, and just successes we've seen, I thought of a couple different things, and this might feel a little off topic to begin with. So in terms of seeing like a communication win, but and we can get into more detail if this seems relevant in questions that might come up later. But I was thinking of a project we did a while ago where we were specifically trying to engage groups that were working, engage groups in a location where there had been substantial conflict over forest management. none of you have had this experience, I'm sure, but unfortunately, we have a lot of contested issues on the landscape. So this was a place where it was, near a community, there was high fire risk, adjacent public lands, substantial recreation use of those lands, and adjacent to a number of private lands as well. There were conflict between groups. There were conflict between the groups and the Forest Service, who was the primary landowner in this area. A lot of frustration around things were going. And for this project, we spent some time. This is where it's going to feel like it might diverge a little, but we actually met with folks from different groups separately and worked with them on developing what we've referred to as sort of conceptual maps. So we worked with them on talking about what their desired conditions were. If they could just create the ideal landscape, what would it look like? And then describe where they were currently, and then describe how they think you could go from where we are to where they want to be. And we mapped all this out for them as we did this. So we actually used like Post-it notes and made sort of these maps, these designs that sort of describe what they were looking at. And so we did this individually with people, and then we brought these different groups together to have a conversation collectively about this. And this was not what I was expecting. So the win here was a little bit of a surprise to me too. So as we began, we actually just had all the maps up around the room. All the writing was in our hand, in our own writing, so people couldn't tell whose maps were whose. But I started walking around, and sort of what I was just saying, like one of the most fascinating things was when we came back, we had people sort of share their thoughts about the maps, and people weren't able to identify their own maps. And also I really broke through some preconceived notions around, well, this is how I want the map to be, but clearly these other people want the map to look this way, and they don't have the same ideas about what the landscape should look like, or even an understanding of where we are now. And what came out of this was that there was a lot more commonality than differences when people were looking at it from this perspective, which really got back to sort of the values and what they hope to see on the landscape. And it was a really interesting introduction to this. Again, we kind of did this to kill time as we were starting the meeting, but this turned out to be a really useful thing for people an exercise for people to work through before we engage in these conversations. And I feel like they came to that in a much more open place and ready to have a conversation, recognizing that there was a lot more commonality in their views of what they were looking for than they would have imagined before based on the conflict that had happened there. So I'll end there. It was probably longer than one. Sorry.
No, that was awesome. I can't wait to hear more about that. But I'm going to let Virginia take a chance, Virginia McDaniel, to introduce herself and give us a CAFMS success.
All right, there we go. I was trying to get my mute off. Thanks. Yes, so I am Virginia McDaniel. I am a forestry technician with the Southern Research Station in Hot Springs, Arkansas. Also a certified ecologist for the Ecological Society of America. I kind of got my start in fire, I don't know, over 25 years ago, the Albany Pine Bush Preserve. And I think anyway, I went through the process and there was snow on the ground. So we were like digging line through the snow. That was our practice. Which turned out to be fine because, as I like to say, as people say in the biz, I'm kind of more interested in the creative aspects of fire versus the destructive aspects. I'd rather set fires than necessarily put them out. And that's what I've kind of been doing for the last 25 years, is doing applied management with a lot of fire ecology research. I worked for the Park Service in the southeastern United States, basically doing fire effects monitoring, and then came to the Southern Research Station about 14 years ago here in Arkansas. And so the example that I wanted to provide was the restoration project that's happening here in Arkansas. So I'm gonna tell a story. I really like the story you told, Eric, and I think this one I'm gonna tell has a lot of those aspects that kind of happened before I came on the scene. In terms of getting people on board, but I'll just tell the story and then we can go from there. So this restoration project occurred on the Washita National Forest which is located in western Arkansas and eastern Oklahoma. And it got started because of a 2-ounce woodpecker. One thing that makes it kind of cool. The other thing is it's been going on for over 30 years. So it's kind of a project that spanned the careers. The people that started it have now retired. It's being carried on by new employees. And so for me, that's kind of a testament to the success of this project. So it began in the 1980s. The red cockaded woodpecker recently had been listed as endangered in the Endangered Species Act. And we had a small disjunct population in the Washita, and it was not doing well. because it requires really open canopy with a lot of herbaceous plants that have a lot of, insects to eat. And most of the populations are found in the longleaf pine, but this was, as I said, a disjunct population. And so because of the fire suppression, closed canopy wasn't doing well. So with some encouragement from the Fish and Wildlife Service, the Washita started thinning and burning the forest. And we're burning about every 3 years in an attempt to restore the woodland structure. And what they found was that you can take this closed canopy with just covered with leaf litter, with a few scraggly herbaceous plants coming up, and with some thinning, you allow the light to reach the forest floor, burn that leaf litter off. Just the diversity just exploded of these forbs and grasses. And so it was just kind of a really cool project. And I think one of the things they did when they started it was they got all the groups together. They all went out and they did a field tour, and they said, this is kind of, they had an area where that wasn't treated, and then they had areas that they were treated. And so they could kind of show the environmental groups, they could show the Forest Service, everybody, like, this is what we're doing, and this is why we're doing it. And that explosion of biodiversity, obviously the red-cockaded woodpecker numbers started increasing, and a host of other species. They did a lot of studies like reptiles and birds and pollinators. A lot of different species that don't survive well in these closed canopy forests started increasing. So it kind of made everybody happy. And it also, other cool thing about the project was there was still a steady stream of timber that was coming out of this area. I'm gonna go on one more tangent. I'm just gonna tell a story. So I don't know if you guys remember in 2012 when Hurricane Sandy hit New York City, it took out a bridge in Coney Island, and this bridge, not a bridge, but a boardwalk, sorry. And in order to replace it, it had like 16-foot boards. They needed pine rated as dense in order to rebuild it. And the only place in the country they could find that was on the Washita National Forest in this pine bluestem restoration area. So I think that's kind of the success, is that we're supporting an economy, we're supporting local, mills, and then we're also helping an endangered species and the biodiversity. So that success story was just kind of told in a video. I'm kind of getting long-winded here, Jen, but if Jen could put that in the chat, there's a woodland restoration project that tells this story that I just told, with beautiful videography, music, and people talking about this project. And I wasn't directly involved in this project, but I think it was, in the video making. I have been involved in studying the diversity of this project recently. But I'll just leave it at that and just say that if you can, one means of talking about your study is through videography that has people just talking in plain language and explaining the story, that can have a big success and having people get on board. So there you go.
Yeah, that's awesome. And I think Craig just shared the link there in the chat. And I'm going to just put a disclaimer here that none of us have to apologize for being long-winded today, because we're all here as comms, wearing our comms people badges. So that's sort of our nature, I think. But I'm going to kick it over to John, our second John for the day, John Lampereur. If you'd like to introduce yourself.
Hey, everybody.
Yeah.
Thanks for joining us today, and greetings from Lakewood, Wisconsin. I'm about an hour and a half northwest of Green Bay, and I'm a silviculturist. So I'm involved in fire, but not as directly as a lot of folks are. So I'm working more with the fire managers and with the timber managers, and just trying to bring everybody together. I don't know that I necessarily have a success story so much as work in progress. I've been around, back up here, I've been with Forest Service for 33 years, and 23 of those have been here. And about 16 years ago, we started a restoration project. We started kind of laying the groundwork for it. And it was for Barrens restoration and restoration of northern dry forests and pine oak savanna, things like that. And we went through the whole NEPA process that we need to in the Forest Service. And as part of that process, We reached out to landowners in the area, general public, and didn't hear anything. And as we went along, I just kept saying, I think we need to reach out to these folks and make sure that they're aware of what we're planning on doing out there. We didn't hear much of anything. And then finally, we got to the end where the decision maker was going to sign the document. And I said, okay, after you sign this document, I really think you ought to send out a letter explaining exactly what we are going to do in their backyard. And we did. And I think he got 4 responses, not that interested. Well, when we started to do some prescribed burning in the neighborhood where we had some urban interface, then all hell broke loose. You know, you had a few folks that really got up in arms over it, and they got their neighbors all wound up. And the next thing you know, we set up a public meeting, met with them, and it was definitely a case of a vocal minority. But we engaged with them. And there were some folks that were pretty hot there, but we committed to working closely with them and bringing them along with us as we went through the project. And at that meeting, we had a member of the Northern Research Station Social Science Group. He was with us. It's Paul Gobster. So he and his group, they all got involved, and they said, hey, this is an excellent opportunity to do some social science work because we can get baseline data here. Surprisingly, in their baseline data, they reached out to about, I think it was 1,200 people, and they actually got survey responses on something like 650, which floored us. And the results were pretty surprising too, because, you know, generally when you engage with folks out in the field, you only hear from people who are really mad about things. And generally they give you the impression that you probably couldn't find your butt in the dark with both hands. But surprisingly, we were getting 80% responses to questions like, I trust the local Forest Service managers to know what's right and to support use of timber for ecosystem restoration and use of prescribed fire. So it was pretty encouraging, but we still heard from the other folks pretty often. And so as we've moved along and we've gone through these areas that were forested, heavily forested, and we were turning these landscapes right around their properties into something that resembled more of a clear cut in a lot of cases. You know, and we started to do prescribed fires. We would have some of them engaging with us at the burn site, and we would talk with them and just explain that, yeah, right now they're doing a safety briefing, and right now they're testing for the weather, they're testing the fuels, now they're going to do a spot fire. And these people were just really astonished because they thought that it was going to be a bunch of old bubbas just going out there and dropping matches right in their backyard. So they were pretty surprised. And, you know, over the process of doing this, I think we have won over some hearts and minds. There's a lot of folks that are really against it still, but I think a lot of the people in the neighborhood are kind of shifting their opinions. And that was actually part of the purpose of the social science work, was to get that baseline data, but then as time went by, follow up with other surveys to see if we were moving the needle, if people were becoming more supportive, if they were becoming more concerned, and that sort of thing. So that's my story, and thank you for listening.
Yeah, thank you. And just as a reminder, panelists, feel free to unmute, jump in, give each other feedback, hard times, whatever you want to do. But I'm going to go ahead and start off by talking about some of the questions we received from our registrants. A lot of the people who have registered and who are attending are sort of fall into the categories of researchers and managers. And John, you're absolutely right. A lot of the questions were like, what do we do when people are mad at us? Because that seems to be like conflict is one of those times where we're like, oh, shoot, we should have communicated, both, I'm sure, in personal and professional lives, if I can dare say that. And it kind of reminds me of, if I could share another story, this story I've heard a long time ago about the Wright brothers. Do y'all know about this? That one of the reasons they were so successful is because they would engage in these like hours, sometimes days long arguments, but the way that they communicated was they would divide up their arguments into tactical conversations and emotional conversations. And they would try, and it wasn't that one was more important than the other, but they knew that they could not get to tactics. They couldn't get to talking about data and how things were done until they took care of that emotional component first. And the reason that the questions, going through the questions for the audience reminded me of this is because as researchers and managers, a lot of the questions were about the tactical conversation. They were, how do we show them this data? Like, can we just like shove the papers at them, or, and how can we get them on our side? And less of them were about that emotional side, because to us, it is tactical, or we sort of rely on that as professionals, I think. And so I'm hoping as we can go through this, we could talk about the tactical and the emotional and give them their due. And with that said, I want to start by talking about our audience. Y'all mentioned a pretty wide variety of stakeholders, audiences. So I want to ask how you gather information about your audience. How do you gauge their comfort level with fire, their knowledge about fire? If you have any examples, please feel free to share. And jump in whenever you're ready.
I'll go ahead and share a couple of initial thoughts, and others please feel free to weigh in. So I guess maybe what I'll share is it's really important to do that. So I'll emphasize that. And I think, I think some of the questions are, well, why would it be important? Ultimately, I think we do vary our approach depending on who we're talking to. And I think, these audiences can range from internal, within the agency, to external. And the external, again, there's a variety of groups, and we may need to communicate a little bit differently with those different groups, depending on the time. So it is really important to do that. I think, how do you get to know them is a really good question. I think the time to do that is not after a project. There are times where you have to do that, certainly, but I think putting in the time to really get to meet and to know people is actually really critical. And so building those relationships over time, I think, the description that John gave, and I saw there was a comment in the chat too, about if you can engage in some way of trying to understand your community at a larger scale too, than just, so the individual interactions you have are critical, but I would say if there's a way to try to get a pulse of the larger community, by engaging in some research, that's often, that is an awesome thing to do and can provide really useful feedback too. So I'll just stop there. I don't know if others have things to share.
I was gonna hop in and say I don't have any experience like gauging the interest, but I would say making the information available. I went down. We have an experimental forest about 4 hours south of here, and I helped out with a prescribed burn when I was down there. And one of the things we're actually doing a collaboration with the state. So we're having the state help burn this experimental forest. And I was down there, and the state guy was like, Virginia, what you really need to do is we really need to publish something in the newspaper like a week before we're going to do the burn as to why we're doing the burn, why this ecological and hazardous fuel reduction and ecological restoration is so important here. We need to publish a month before, and then, like the day of the burn or something. We just need to get the information out there. And while I was down there, I put together a video just about how we're working together with the state to get the prescribed burns done. And so I think, anyway, just making the information available, whether it's in a local newspaper or, on social media, on Facebook, on Twitter, on Instagram, that we're going to do this is helpful. And we are going to do it and why. And yeah, if there's an opportunity where people could ask questions, make that available as well.
Two things that I'd say as you're going about your daily business out in the woods is you see somebody walking along, stop and talk to them. Or if they flag you down, you stop and talk to them. And the primary thing you got to do is just listen. You don't do the talking, let them do the talking, gauge where they're at, find out, what their concerns are. Or if they don't have any concerns, that's fine too. You can at least drive away with them having a favorable impression of the local managers, and that's going to buy you a lot in the long run.
Yeah, I'll just totally agree with that. I think, John, that's a really good point. I think those informal interactions, I think often aren't necessarily the top of mind when we think about communication. but they're super critical. I totally agree with that. So I think being available and engaging in those conversations doesn't mean you stop doing, you still are doing work and you need to do your work, but having those moments to just talk to someone, yeah, they can be hugely influential. And that's a great point.
I think probably one of the biggest things is, I come from kind of a different aspect than most people on this webinar. Again, I don't work for a federal agency. I work with private landowners. I live in a private land state, and I work in the Great Plains, which is, 89% total private lands. Oklahoma is 95% private lands. So I deal with private landowners and the private people of doing that. But again, a lot of that's still the same. A lot of the same thing. Biggest part of it is that I see, especially talking and communicating with fire, is you do have to adjust your message to who your audience is. Again, I go speak at a county level, County Cattlemen's Association. So I talk about prescribed fire and the benefits of fire with cattle weight gains, body condition scores, external parasites, forage quality, woody plant control, all that. Then the next thing I'll do is I'll go talk to the master gardeners group in a different county. And so now we talk about wildflowers and butterflies. You don't go talk about butterflies and wildflowers to cattle guys, and you don't go talk about cattle weight gains and grazing to a bunch of gardeners. So you definitely have to adjust what you're talking about. Still, a lot of it's still all the core information is still core. Fire is important. What's the need for fire? How do we do it? That's a big part of it. But adjusting that, and even going talking to a group of third graders, we can do that. And probably one of the biggest things I see from working around that and working too, also, again, I work at a university in the Great Ivory Tower of stuff, is a lot of researchers, they don't know how to communicate their information to the general public. We try to talk well over their head and use big words, and there's no such, you can't get anything done with that. It's just like a presentation. You present a presentation with good information about, red cockaded woodpecker and all that, and tortoises and wildflowers. But you start giving them metric units and things like that, they have no clue what we're talking about. You got to make sure you put stuff on a level that your audience can understand. That's the biggest part of it, is put it on. Don't talk over anybody, don't talk down to them, talk with them. Big part of it. And it goes a long ways.
Yeah, absolutely. I have had many a debate with a researcher about the term herbaceous species. That's one that gets me every time. I'm like, no one said, would you say that to your mom? No, you wouldn't call it an herbaceous species. All right. So I'm hearing a lot about listening to the audience, sort of that seek first to understand philosophy, and really hearing about their values and what's important to them. And so we got a great sort of set of questions about what do you do if your audience is changing? How do you adjust? How do you get a pulse on what that change is? Whether it's their attitudes towards fire, maybe they've experienced a recent wildfire and don't feel so good about controlled burns anymore, or they're just sensitive to fire in general, or if their demographics are changing. We had a lot of questions about people moving into areas from other areas where they're less accustomed to fire. What do y'all have on that?
I think you listen again, and you find out what's important to them, and you find areas of commonality that you both that are of value to you. Might be the Packers for starters, and you get some small talk going, and then you get into actually delving into what's really on their mind.
See, that doesn't work in the college football states in the South. We can't. You're likely to make worse enemies.
Everybody's a Packers fan up here.
There you go.
Yeah, I think that's it's a real challenge. I think recognizing that the environment's dynamic, and what worked in the past isn't always going to be the same thing that works in the future. I think it's really important. And again, investing in sort of like working through and figuring that out. I really appreciate, and actually what my first thought was very similar. There was a comment in the chat about finding a local community spark plug. who has credibility in the local community. That was actually the first thing that came to my mind. Finding someone that you develop a relationship with and you can have trust with, that also has trust within the community, can be really critical, both to help inform you about those changes they may be recognizing, but also giving you sort of entree into, places you might not have it otherwise, either you individually or having them actually, be out there helping communicate as well.
Working to get people buy-in into what you're trying to do, that's huge. Again, we see that a lot. Again, like I said, working with private landowners and getting them to utilize fire and do that. A lot of times, we can work in an area or community with folks that there's a lot of times in our area, there's always somebody that's burning, that does some burning and knows a little bit about it. Again, you work with them and get them on your side, because again, the specialists or the experts can go anywhere they, and talk and do that. But again, like with working with landowners, whenever they hear their peers talking about what it has done for me, it's double of what my experience and expertise can do in that region. And that's always been a big plus. And so a lot of times too, if we're putting on programs or having to do that, is if you can get a local person that's involved, that has buy-in into it, that can actually speak too. You want somebody that can speak well too. You don't want somebody that they're going to bore people to death and they're not going to listen. But have them talk about their experiences with it, what it's done for them, how it's helped them, how it's improved, whatever, all the benefits they can find. And that goes a long ways within a community or an area to help promote a program of, no matter what you're trying to do.
One thing that I'll add with this whole discussion is it really helps a lot when you've got people that are in a community for a long period of time. You don't have people rotating through a ranger district every year and a half, because then you totally lose connection with the local population.
Yeah, that's a great point. It's a lot more groundwork to reestablish relationships as they change. People are moving in and out. All right, so I'm going to ask the $1 million question related to a larger question. Is it prescribed fire? Is it controlled burn? And we could you can feel free to put in your vote, but basically my question is about, maybe it should be a larger question about, does the language matter? Should we be switching terminology and what language we use depending on the audience, and how, maybe if you can give some examples about times when you do change your language or if you don't.
I like prescribed fire because it indicates there's more forethought. It's prescribed. You've thought about what the objectives are and exactly what you're trying to do first before you start lighting it. And controlled implies that, okay, we're burning it, now we're controlling it. That's just my 2 cents.
Yeah, I depends on my audience. I try to always use them. I kind of use them interchangeably. There was a national survey done, about 10, 15 years ago, that found that 4% of the general public in the U.S. found that prescribed fire was a knowledgeable term. 4%. Where I think controlled burning, it was just a little over 60% or over 50% kind of understood what it is. And they actually liked the term controlled because it had the word control in it. And again, as fire professionals, we all know, to me, controlled burning is burning junk. That's just people burning junk and brush piles. Prescribed fire. So when I do talk to a group, I try to define it, what I'm talking to that group, to make sure everybody's on the same page. I will try to use them interchangeably. I don't like controlled burning, but if I've got to use it, I've got to use it, because again, I try to adjust to my audience and what makes them feel comfortable with doing that. But also at the same time, I try to go ahead and explain to them what is that difference. Go ahead and explain to them what that difference is, and then that way we can use the term prescribed, which gives us, which we know more is there is definitely more planning and more prescribed into that, and people should like that better.
Yeah, I was going to say that's kind of interesting, because I feel like I use prescribed burn, like, because I work for the Southern Research Station, I tend to use that. I don't really use controlled burn at all. That's probably an indication of maybe I don't talk to the public as much as you all do. And that's really kind of good to hear that, maybe I need to, think about adjusting my language when I do. make that clear. So thank you guys.
I'm the only one who hasn't spoken, so I guess I'll share too. I would lean towards prescribed myself, but I think John's point about the audiences is really important, and it does not at all surprise me. I don't remember those survey results, but that doesn't all at all surprise me. I think there's an intuitive sort of way of understanding controlled burning that's different. But and this matches maybe some of the comments in the chat too. My concern with controlled burning is that it may, in some ways, there's always uncertainty to some degree with fire use, and that it might, if there is something that gets out of prescription, it may, that I would think that might cause some challenges in the future. When we try to do this again, people will say, well, if it was controlled, then then what happened? It can come back to us, but results in some loss of trust. You're going to have to deal with some of that regardless of what you've called it before, if you'd have some of that happen potentially too. So anyways, yeah, good question.
Yeah,
I don't have to deal with it on the front lines like everyone, like the rest of you do too. So it's interesting to hear how you're thinking about it.
I think it's interesting to see in the chat too that people say sometimes they use both, sometimes most of the time they use prescribed fire. And I'll say, I think as y'all are talking about it, I realized I use prescribed fire when I talk to colleagues, fire professionals. And I do try to use controlled burn with the public, and that's mostly based off, there's been research done by the Nature Conservancy. They hired a firm to do research, and they do it every few years. And they say controlled burn tracks better with the public because prescription, they actually trust prescription less due to the medical connotation of it. They're like it's sort of like the people that say, well, they just practice medicine. They're like, oh, you're just practicing fire, sort of an idea. So yeah, it's an interesting topic, but I think definitely changing terms depending on who's listening is important. And when we're talking about changing language, maybe we should talk about sort of the tools that we use for communication. So Virginia, you mentioned making information available like through the newspaper and things like that. I guess I'm curious if you want to throw in, what are some of your maybe favorite communications tools? What are your go-tos right now? Things you're excited about, things that you're using right now? Or how do you decide which tool you're going to use to reach an audience?
That's a good question. I mean, I feel like right now I've been writing a lot, and just a lot of what I'm just kind of getting into the communications world, to be honest. I've just been doing it for about a year and just on and off. So through the Southern Research Station, our communication blog, Compass Live, is a place that we've been putting information out. And then, we have a kind of a quarterly publication that kind of tells you what the Southern Research Station is up to. And that always has a fire section because we're in the Southeast, we do a lot of fire work. I feel like we need to expand the communication to do more of a general audience. I feel like we're kind of reaching the Forest Service people and more professionals, but in terms of reaching a more general audience, not quite sure we're doing that. It's just like, that's actually something that we're working on right now at the Southern Research Station is how do we reach more people? And I mean, I was just at a fire effects training with the regional fire ecologist, Beth Buchanan, and she was kind of like, the best way to reach people is in person, and that's kind of, with COVID, that's been difficult for the last couple of years. But I think it kind of goes back to what we've been saying the whole time is like engaging the public, like John said, is you meet somebody, just talk to them about whatever, you meet them on their level and ask what they're interested in, and then go from there. I think there's I think people still read newspapers to some extent. So, I mean, maybe older people, probably, I'm kind of old. So social media is probably where we need to be going. Instagram, Twitter, TikTok, I don't know. That might be a way to reach the younger people and get our message out. And then the thing that I'm like actually super, super excited about is making videos and And we just got a contract with the Southern Research Station to have someone actually write music for the video. So, because I think, you know, with the government, we're kind of constrained. We have to use this non-copyrighted music, which is kind of terrible. It can make kind of a good story just fall flat with some cheesy music. But if you can combine like a really good story, really decent videography, and like inspiring music or something, that can kind of reach hearts and minds and maybe change. I don't know. That's just it's kind of my latest soapbox. So there's a ramble through that.
I like to use historic photography a lot, and also tactile things like, you know, a slab of wood that has all sorts of fire scars in it, so we can explain what role fire had historically and how we'd like to reintroduce that and start to convert some of our current landscapes back to something that resembles what we have in these old pictures. Our average landowner around here, I think the average age is something like 60, so they're not very techy. So I think if you do it in a presentation, or if you do it in a newspaper article or something like that, that's probably going to be your best bet. They're not going to be checking Facebook and Twitter that much.
I'd kind of add in on that, but I guess 3 examples. And again, these are examples of what we're using to try to promote people to use fire. Again, I probably do 20 to 30 public meetings every year to landowners, whether at a county or a state level and things, and try to do that. One of the best things I've found on doing that is just like what John said, is the historic photographs. I've got a collection of historic photographs that I'll throw up on the screen and show landowners. And I've also used it to talk to a group of engineers at Boeing in Oklahoma City. And I used the same talk, toned it down to what they want to do, but showed them the historic photographs of Oklahoma, what the landscape used to look like, you know, from the 1890s, early 1900s. And you can see people's face, and their reaction is totally like, yeah, we've got to start burning, or yes, fire was important and fire is important. To me, that's probably the top thing as for a specific example of what to use of doing that. And, you know, and then showing landowners how they can use fire to get that to their property now. You know, we can still do that. We can still use that. The next thing that probably has been a big success is I have a set of season of burn demonstration and research plots out at our research station west of Stillwater, Oklahoma. And I take people out there. They're small plots. They're 30 meters by 30 meters in size, but we burn them at different seasons of the year, every 2 years. Those plots have changed USDA policy on CRP burning, all kinds of stuff, but also it's changed the thought of a lot of landowners and people about when you can burn. Because again, we show that fire is good year round. You know, it don't matter what time of year you're burning, just burn something and get that done. And being able to walk out there and see that and do that is huge. A picture is worth 1,000 words. Well, an actual burnt plot that they can walk in is worth 1,000,000, big time. You know, and a lot of that's old school because I'm old. I'm old school person, do that. But I have been more active on the social media, and I think that's important. And first off, we have a great social media expert in our department here, and she's actually on the webinar here today. Allison Thompson, give a shout out. She does such a great job. We give her content and she makes us look really good, and she makes a lot of fire. And Allison, if you would put our Facebook and Twitter stuff up on the chat so everybody knows where it's at, so they can look at it, because she does such a great job. And we're getting so much response from that. It's really great to see that. And so, you know, we use the whole gamut, and I think it's going to take everything that you can throw at them to get people to understand fire and the importance of it.
Yeah, I think that's great. The one thing I was thinking of too with this, and it really goes along, I think, with what you just shared there too, John, is I think the tools we use, we should be thoughtful about those and, use different tools depending on our goals with the communication. I think ultimately different methods of communication are going to be more effective at different things. So if we're trying to help people, like a notification about an upcoming project or, something like that, then whatever we can do to sort of blast that information out there so it's available, it's sort of, it's probably fairly, there's not a lot of depth necessarily to what's there, but it's about a specific project. And if we want to engage on, more conversations that might lead to a more in-depth understanding of what we're trying to achieve, potentially, trying to like persuade people in certain ways about how they're thinking about things, get people to adopt different practices. Like those are going to take more hands-on, more involved, I think, communication channels or communication approaches. And I think just being thoughtful and being clear about what we're trying to achieve with our communication messages can help us point us to the right, to different tools that we might use. And not that we wouldn't want them to be connected. So ultimately, using those sort of mass communication approaches, being able to have links to more in-depth opportunities, even just as we're doing here, like sharing stuff in the chat. So people who are interested in learning more, who want to get out on the ground, like they've got ways to do that. That's a moment to capture sort of broad attention. There will be some filtering before we get to those that are more engaged, but then having those opportunities to discuss. And I'll just note one of the things that I did during my PhD research was actually looking at communication methods around fire. And certainly, like if we looked at sort of knowledge growth and attitude change, those were much more likely to come when people were engaged in some way, what we called these sort of interactive opportunities. So for the most part, they included interaction with a person. So, they'd be on the ground using demonstration plots like John was describing. The impact of those was just massive, pretty consistently with our audiences. But even if there are things that can be set up that might be self-guided, so maybe they were at a museum or a visitor center where they were able to engage a little more hands-on with things, those can be really effective too. But that interactive nature is really critical. And then those sort of broad awareness building things we might think of as more, it's just one way information flow. It's unidirectional. And I think we just, ultimately there's going to be limitations on what that can accomplish. It's great at notifying, but ultimately to get more in-depth sort of outcomes, we're going to probably have to have more in-depth, opportunities to engage.
Yeah, that's a great point. And I think you made a great point of saying, we have to have multiple opportunities. And it makes me think about, we can't just burn once and then we're done. We have to repeat that effort as well. So just sort of tying that together. And I always call it breadcrumbs. One of the things that I developed was the Fire Learning Trail. It's an educational trail that has signs in the ground, but I was like, these signs aren't enough. That's my take home point if that's all they get. But then we had an associated podcast, an audio tour, and then a chance to engage with fire professionals after that. And I'm like, you just got to like draw them into the conversation, the little breadcrumbs. I did have a really specific question that I'll throw out to anyone that's done video content. Where have you found this is from the chat. So where have you found is the best place to publish video content? Where does your audience reliably consume video that you've developed?
I haven't quite looked at the metrics of how many views videos are getting, so I don't really know the answer to that. I mean, I know through the Forest Service, we have is it Vimeo? Is that right? Venmo is the money thing, and Vimeo is the video one. Yeah. And then if it goes to the national, it goes on YouTube. I think we're kind of constrained with the government as to they tell us where to put it, and it goes there. It goes on our website. I mean, I guess it might go on Facebook and Twitter, but I'm sorry, I don't have the metrics. Somebody may be working on the metrics right now. But yeah, I'm not much help, sorry. We're kind of.
I think as long as you can get a video up in an easily shareable format, so usually that would be through YouTube. And if I can make a plug we always talk about building capacity for the fire line, but you can build capacity through communication too. So if you can get a usable link, a way to share it, not a file, but somewhere you can just share someone a quick link or a QR code, and then share it through your partners, have your choir preach for you, have them share your video. That's the best way to get it out is,
those are great points,
that kind of terminology, but like supporting each other to share this information, these products, I think is really, really helpful. All right, so we're at the top of the hour. I think it's time that we get into the section that I titled on my notes, the hard stuff. And we sort of dabbled in this a little bit. We talked a little bit about receiving criticism from the public and how you deal with people that are mad or concerned. How do we talk about the complicated nature of fire, the need for more managed fires, wildfires, the fact that not all controlled burns can be called #good fire, the need for repeated fire? How do you get those messages across?
I'll take a first stab at some of it.
Great. Thank you, John.
Some of it is, again, a lot of it's regional. I guess I'll go back to kind of an experience to look at, because I know it's different regionally, and again with who we're trying to deal with and work with. Back in about 2005, we experienced a pretty good drought here in Oklahoma and Texas. There was some pretty good wildfires that had occurred and things. And I was sitting there thinking, going, man, this is going to hurt our fire program. You know, people are not going to burn, you know, they're not going to want to burn and stuff. It's going to, you know, scare them. And I was at a statewide meeting not too long after some of that, and all of a sudden during that meeting, I had 5 different landowners come up to me and go, man, we need to start burning. We had a wildfire over by our place, and man, it looked so good. It cleared out all these cedars and did all this and doing that. And it was like, oh, wow. And I have actually found that in our part of the world, a lot of times when we have wildfires, it encourages more burning, because people see those benefits. And then building on that, that's a lot of times what we see on the hard stuff, getting landowners to burn. And a lot of times they have crotchety old neighbors that, you know, are like, oh, we don't want fire. We don't like fire. You know, you get this on our place, we're going to sue you and do all this kind of stuff, which, you know, it's just all talk. And then they start burning, and then those neighbors see those effects and see the improvement that's going on. And it's like, hey, can we burn with you next year? We want to start doing that too. And so a lot of times, again, we do it properly, we do it right. It builds on itself, and it actually, you know, will start to sell itself to a point. You know, again, a lot of it's regional. A lot of it's with what you're trying to do. Again, with private landowners, a lot of times they are at their wits' end economically and stuff, because again, they're trying to make a living off that land, and you know, they don't have, you know, a lot of money trying to, you know, keep that bottom line the way they are. And fire is that method to do that cheaply, effectively, and achieve a whole lot of benefit. And so they're able to see that, you know, going different from, you know, homeowners and, you know, the general public is a little different. But from that aspect, a lot of times fire does help build on itself with certain groups and stuff. And so I think a lot of times don't just expect that, oh, we had a wildfire, that it's all going to be negative. Actually had one rancher's got a great quote here from Northwest Oklahoma. He goes, you know, he said, a wildfire and new fences sure make a guy look like a great land manager, you know? And so that's some good comment that people can do. So, you know, a lot of times it's not all as bad as we think it is.
I'm in a part of the country where I would say that the average landowner around here is probably a whole lot less open to fire. I think a lot of folks around here are still living under the myth that this was an asbestos forest, even though we are I sit in the very footprint of the Peshtigo fire, where I'm sitting here right now. And I think that actually has something to do with it, because there's this tradition that we had these massively dangerous and most deadly fires in the country right around here, and we need to put out the fire. But at the same time, there's a lot of folks that are not too far removed from the farm, and they understand that you have to actually work with the land, and they've done a certain amount of burning themselves. So it's not a lost cause. And I think that one of the biggest things that the most useful things that we can do around here is to get as much information as we can about the historical fire frequency. It really shocks people to find out that these areas around here burn just as frequently as the West. I mean, they think of that as the arid West where it burned. They get that, but that wasn't here in Wisconsin. Well, yes, it was. And when we can show them that that evidence in fire scars and fire histories and a lot of these things that we've been gradually collecting, it's helpful. And then you take that and you show landscapes where we've used fire. And I think aesthetics can't be, you can't overstate the value of aesthetics. If people see something that looks pretty, wow, they'll support it.
Yeah, I love when you have those burned and unburned sites like right across the road from each other. And people think they want that unburned closed canopy. And then they go, oh, that woodland looks so nice. Looks like a deer could just stroll right through it.
Yeah, I think these are really good comments. I was just thinking just of this too, and just in I think sort of embracing these difficult conversations. I think they can be, we could want to try to avoid them, but I think it's important to try to embrace them, and they're there, whether we manage them or not, they're going to be influencing how people are viewing things. So it's important to sort of recognize that. And I one of the things that came to my mind sort of as we started talking about this was when I was doing my graduate work at Oregon State, there was a district over just across the Cascades from me, so near like Sisters in Bend, Oregon, in that area, that was really active at putting burns in very visible places. And initially, it was really impressive. And initially, there was a lot of resistance to that. But then it was right on a scenic highway, and it was very visible. And as you had the changes over time, I think it turned into a really amazing teaching opportunity for them. And the traffic they had through there was huge. And it was also right across from a very expensive vacation development location that there was a lot of work beforehand to sort of get it in there, and a lot of frustration from that community to begin with. But that was an example of where it was somewhere that needed to be burned to. So it wasn't they were just putting it there, but it really was. I think there was a lot of pre-work on their part to get this in, but it led to a lot of wins in a lot of ways that I think allowed them to then expand that program and go to other places because of that trust they built up there.
I guess I'm the one that hasn't spoken. I guess one thing I was thinking about is that, no action is also an action, right? And so if we don't do anything and a fire burns down 100 people's houses, and then we're kind of heroes as firefighters, but, if we could have done something to prevent, how do you, anyway, that's just one thing. And then Randy Morse, he said that, 99.84% of our prescribed fires go as planned. And how do we tell that story more often? Because if you look at that 0.16, that gets a lot of stories, and it should get a lot of stories, because it's, we goofed up, and that's a problem, and it needs to be, we need to think about that, but we also need to get the message. I mean, 99.84, that is a lot of prescribed fire that is doing a lot of good. And I call it I was like, we need to do a blog called Another Boring Burn.
Yes. Yeah, I say that all the time. I love to show how boring controlled burns are. That's my own. So get ready, here comes the controlled burn video. And it's just slowly creeping across the leaves. We have a video like that where it was actually a camera trap that was in a controlled burn. I'm like, watch it again.
Oh, really?
It's boring.
Awesome. We need that with just some exciting music, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
All right.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. I think you're right that no action is an action. No communication is communication, right? Too. And I saw somewhere in the comments someone talking about the good fire, bad fire message, and I'll say that as a proponent of the good fire message, I think that bad fire message is already there. at least where I work, it's either it's bad fire or it doesn't happen here. This is what we hear a lot in the Southern Apps, in the Southern Appalachians. And so I think having that good fire message as a contrast, and that wildfires can be good fires, you know, no lives are lost, no properties damaged. It has a role in these systems, and it's part of the process. Is something that we really try to get across. It's not, I think one of my challenges in recent years has been not just putting prescribed fire versus wildfire in the messaging, which was something we relied on for a long time, but that managed wildfires also have a place. And holy moly, it's already 12:08 here in the Eastern time zone. So
let me just say thanks, Jen, for saying that. That was exactly what my thought track was, like prescribed fire. What? No, that's not because wildfire can be good too. So yeah, there you go. Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah, my pleasure. As I said, fire all day, every day. That's what I do. So we haven't talked that much about building partnerships. So I want to at least throw one sort of network building, partnership building question out there. Do you have any advice or tips for building partnerships? We got questions from researchers who have managers that don't trust their data. We have managers who really want to connect with researchers. We had someone asking about how you get the quote was rugged individualist types to join PBAs that, you know, they might not be the joiner type. How do you get them to join a prescribed burn association, or how you can engage with tribal nations? We had a lot of questions about engaging with tribal nations. So any advice you want to throw out there for network building, partnership building with any of these groups?
Reach out to your neighbors and be a friend. I mean, we routinely have members of the Menominee Indian Reservation just to the south of us. They come up and help out on prescribed burns, and we engage with them, and we go see their projects. They come up and see ours, and we look for ways where we can work together across boundaries. Wisconsin Department of Natural Resources, we work really closely with them. They come out to our burns as well, and we try to coordinate timber sales and things like that for land management restoration. But yeah, reach out. Don't just stay in your bubble.
Yeah. Oh, sorry, Jen. I just beat you by a second. I'll be quick momentarily, but I was just going to know, I think they might have already sort of, Craig might have dropped this in the chat already, but there was a research that I was part of a group that developed a number of years ago that can be useful in this, I think, called like building partnerships, where we were going along with some of the places where I was doing my doctoral work. And I'll try to grab it too and stick it in just so it's more recent. But where I was doing my graduate work, my doctoral work, and he was actually doing some filming and working with landowners. This was all way back in the time where, the question about where do we post videos, this was like, we produced DVDs and sent them to people because we didn't really have access yet to the webs, quite the level we do now in terms of sharing stuff. But it's older, but the stories are actually shared, the voices of the people who are on the ground actually building these partnerships. So I think it can be really useful. And so I'll try to stick that one back in there. I'll see if I can. Oh yeah, that might be it there, Craig. But thanks for being able to sort through my things to sort of put that in there. But I agree. I mean, I think it takes time. It takes investment of resources. I think being out there with the community, and it needs care and feeding over time too. So it's not just done after you've done it once, but continue to engage with people, and engage with them and like during projects and be there available when things aren't happening too. So that relationship is sort of an ongoing thing. I think that is really important. Yes, thank you. I think that was the one I was thinking of. Thanks, Craig, for sorting through my my things to find it.
I was just going to comment that again, you got to try to work with as many different groups, agencies, whatever you can to get things going. Because again, it's always important to have, critical mass or more people involved. It always looks better. But also, on the other hand, once you get something going, you can't just sit and wait for other groups to to do their part. If they're not willing to do their part, do that, don't slow down and wait for them. Because I've seen that bog down a lot of programs where you try to invite too many people to get involved, and you're trying to get everybody to vote yes or do whatever. And it's like, no, you just need to keep going ahead. And if they would like to be a part of your program, good, bring them on. If they don't, let them set aside and not worry about it. But most of the time, you get something going and people will, and other groups want to be a part of it and doing that. And I think that's one thing we've had great success in Oklahoma is we've got a great partnership with a lot of all the state agencies and the federal folks, agencies, NRCS, and U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and stuff that we have here in Oklahoma that help all the private landowners. Everybody kind of works together to do that. And that's been a great thing to work at. And, and I travel around and talk all over the country and do that. And a lot of times I just don't, I don't hear that where you've got a lot of great collaboration going on, and it makes me feel fortunate for what we've got here. And again, I don't know how or why it works as well as it did. Maybe we're just really friendly here in Oklahoma, but we try to be. But getting that and getting a lot of people involved, it definitely makes a huge difference. And another thing we've done and worked with trying to get more information out, what we see, especially across state line borders and stuff, working with private landowners. Again, we write a lot of fact sheets and stuff about, how to do fire and the importance of fire and things like that. And it's interesting because a lot of times that state line is such a difference. It's like you go to Kansas and present information. They say, well, that's well and good. That's from Oklahoma, but this is Kansas. Fire is no different in Kansas as it is in California, as it is in Oklahoma, as it is in Florida. It's just different, a little bit different weather and different stuff, but fire's fire. There's no change in the chemical reaction of fire and doing that. And so we've started working. We're a big group of extension folks from all the different states. We work together and we put all of our names on a lot of fact sheets, and we also put that state logo on there because that way, OSU, Oklahoma State University, may publish the fact sheet and it's from Oklahoma State University, but it's got on the back page, it's got K-State's logo, it's got University of Nebraska, it's got North Carolina State University with Jen Fawcett on there. We do that, and whenever it goes to those states, people look at it and say, oh yeah, that's from our state, and so it gives them more buy-in on stuff too. And that's a big part of it, and seeing that, and also seeing those other groups buy in on a lot of things too. That's always important.
Yeah, I love that you said, well, it's different here in Kansas. And you're right, it's not different, but it feels different. It gets back to that like tactical versus emotional. It feels different to that. It feels like it should be different. For sure. Anyone else on building partnerships? No? All right. So it's 12:15 here, 11:15 for our central folks. So I want to try and sort of wrap this up, and I'll ask maybe one final question and just give you all an opportunity. What is your take-home point? Like, what's a point that maybe we haven't gotten to yet, or that you just can't leave without emphasizing for this audience, or maybe sort of empowering them as they go out to communicate, go out to talk about fire?
Most of us went into natural resources to go out in the woods and not really have to deal with the public very much. We've all heard that.
Yes.
But the reality really strikes home when you actually get out and you do it, and you find out that it's everything about dealing with the public. And you just need to embrace it, and you got to realize that everything in life pretty much comes down to being a sales job. And what is it you're trying to sell? You're trying to sell the idea why restoration is a good thing, why you're introducing fire back to the landscape is a good thing. And you just need to, if what you want to accomplish out on the ground is important to you, you need to embrace that and do it.
Yeah, and that's a really good point. And the thing that I was thinking of too is that communication is everyone's job, and I think this really goes along with what you were just sharing there too, John. that, even those of us who don't have roles that might have communication written as part of our position description, in the end, we're part of an agency or organization that's working these spaces, and we're going to get asked questions, and it's part of our job to be engaged with that. And I think too, back to maybe something that I started with at the beginning, is that idea of trying to bring it back down to, and John, again, you said this exactly too, like the idea of what are we trying to achieve if our goal is restoration. I think if we can get back down to those values, what it is we're hoping to achieve on the landscape, these bigger picture concepts, that there actually is a lot of agreement on these. And I think if we can help focus our messaging and our communication around that, that doesn't mean all the conflict will go away, but I think it does. We can often find commonality there, and then we can build back to start describing why we're taking the approaches we're doing, and also be willing to listen when people share other ideas. And sometimes people have good ideas or good reasons why different approaches may or may not work in certain places too. And being willing to listen to that, I think, is also really significant. But I think that maybe that final message of trying to get back again, when we're communicating, think about what's the ultimate value or the goal of this communication, and the goal of sort of the larger project we're talking around. And can we sort of build around that? And how does that change how we approach our communication? It's not just for this project, it's this bigger idea of restoration and these larger goals we're trying to achieve.
Yeah, and I was going to say that an idea that's been communicated to me this year, I have to give credit to Joe O'Brien and to Cecil Frost, and probably other people as well. But we often talk about fire as a disturbance, right? But fire is not the disturbance, it's the lack of fire that's the disturbance. And that's kind of like, so, if you think about rain, is rain a disturbance? It's like, well, too much rain is a disturbance. Not enough rain is a disturbance. But rain in general, it's just part of the ecosystem, right? It helps plants grow. And I think fire is the same thing. And you could look at, different ecosystems have evolved to different amounts of fire, just like different ecosystems have evolved to different amounts of rain. The desert has not much rain, and the tropical rainforest has lots of rain. Longleaf pine forest, lots of fire. Up north, maybe your fire return interval is, a little bit longer. So that's kind of my, does not have a lot to do with communication. It's just a message that was communicated to me that I want to communicate.
That's a good message. I think sometimes giving people like those words is really helpful too. The key messages is important.
Yeah.
I think the other thing that we often forget is that there's a whole lot more that unites us than separates us. We get so focused on the things that we disagree on. And I think there's so many things that if we just stop and set aside our prejudices, we realize, yeah, I can buy off on that. That guy's right, and I think that's really where we need to go when we're communicating with the public, as we're trying to get good things done out of the land.
Yeah, I'll say I've worked in a lot of different systems where people just did not care about the work that we were doing. They were just, and we really needed public support and public interest, but they just didn't. They were like, no, I have like kids to feed and things like that, which is important. But I'll say I will take someone who's mad and who cares and who shows up any day over someone that's not going to show up, because I feel like, which maybe is counterintuitive, but if you have someone there who's really caring about the forest or the grasslands, whatever you're managing, and they're passionate enough and they care enough to show up, then usually you can like pivot that passion with some information and some trust building, as opposed to just writing them off. And let me tell you, those people that you are able to pivot become the biggest, loudest, most vocal supporters for the work that you're doing. We have a couple that are like sort of locally famous around here, and they're just incredible people, incredible spokespeople and spark plugs like we talked about. All right, well, with that then I can kick it back to Andrea. She has some closing thoughts. I know we have some notes about evaluations and upcoming stuff.
Wow, can I just can I just say, wow, what an amazing discussion this has been. I just want to say thank you so much, Jen, for moderating today's discussion. And thank you so much to John, Eric, Virginia, and John for participating in this discussion. And then mostly, I also want to say thank you to all of our participants who joined us today. I was keeping up with the chat window during the discussion as well, and really enjoyed all of the questions and comments that folks were offering and insights that folks were sharing from their own communities. So again, thank you all for participating today. Before we go, I want to plug our next panel discussion. So if you liked this and you want to come back for more, we hope you will. On December 15th, same time, so 11 a.m. to 12:30 p.m. Eastern, we will be discussing fire and water, and we have a really great lineup. Stephanie Laster with the Southern Research Station will be moderating that discussion. And we have Randy Kolka, Stephen Brantley, Kathy Hawes, and James Bose all planning on attending as our panelists. So I know we're going to have another really good discussion. So I guess with that, we can just call it a wrap, and we hope that we'll see you all again in December. Thank you so much for participating today.